Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, this is the trigger warning. This is a horror podcast, so we're going to be talking about horror things. Go figure. But yeah, that could involve sensitive subjects such as child abuse, rape, F-bombs, bad things. Who knows? So we got to do this disclaimer just in case.
Don't let that go away.
Yeah, what are you doing here? Go away. It's over. Go home.
Go home.
Let's see. What do we have coming up, Steve?
Well, we've still got like 10, 12 people on the calendar because people keep getting added. So not going to go through that. But I think a director, an actor, mostly authors right now for our stuff that's going on. So Chris's webcomic Pieces is at piecesofflesh.com. It is a horror-themed webcomic about a clan of not necrotic, necromantic cannibals. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
My book, A Guide to the Recovery Toolbox, is available all kinds of different places. If you're starting into recovery, that's a good field resource guide. It's not really like a self-help book in the normal sense. It's meant as a field guide to introduce you to about 80 of the tools that I learned through 12-step and therapy and stuff like that. Basically get you up to speed on a lot of the phrases that you'll hear so that you can start learning what you need to learn a lot faster. Patreon, we are pushing for supporters. The lowest entry level is $2 a month. We release 2 episodes a month, so that's like $1 per episode.
It's a good deal.
That's I mean, you can't even buy a pack of gum for $1 anymore. Mainly what we want to do right now is, if we can hire somebody to help us with the editing. I mean, editing can take 6-10 hours for some episodes, and that's a lot of time. We'd rather produce more content. So yeah. I think that's good enough for now. Today's guest, Mr. Brian Keene, author. Thank you for joining us. We talked earlier about this. The things you're probably best known that the audience would know you for are 3 different series. You've got The Rising, Earthworm Gods, and The Lost Level. And I'm aware you also have a podcast.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've written, almost 60 books at this point.
Nice.
Plus, various comic books for Marvel and DC and others, and several podcasts over the years. So it's neat. I'm at the point where people know me for different things, and they'll come to the signing, and the adult who's been reading me since high school knows me for something, and their kid who is maybe 12 or 13 or 14 knows me for something completely different. So that's kind of neat.
No, that's good. Keeps it spread out that way. That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
I know we talked a little bit about the gist of what we do here. Basically, we break it into like 4 segments. It's we talk about your childhood, teenage years, and adulthood, about what you were a fan of more than your body of work. And then at the end, we see if we can identify any common themes that have cropped up and see if it says anything to, speaks to something personal that you get out of horror. And the goal is, obviously short term, anybody who listens to this who's a fan of your work can potentially get to know you a little bit better. And long term, if we do this with enough people, maybe we might start seeing some trends that tell us something interesting about the horror community as a whole. But that said, it's not meant to be a therapy session. So if there's any question you don't want to answer, you just say pass and we'll move on.
Right.
But starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
My very first, the earliest scary thing, and the thing that put me on my path as a creator, it was the comic books of the 1970s.
Okay.
DC Comics had a lot of great horror titles like Ghosts and Weird War and House of Secrets, House of Mystery. But Marvel had some amazing stuff too, particularly what Steve Gerber was doing with titles like The Man-Thing and the Defenders. Defenders was ostensibly a superhero book, but having Doctor Strange as the team leader, 90% of the threats they faced were supernatural or monsters or the occult. So, I was 6, 7, 8 years old, just devouring that stuff. And, I have a distinct memory of being 8 years old and reading an issue of the Defenders. And what I would do is I would get a dictionary out and look up the words I didn't know.
Right.
And in doing that, I noticed the credit box on the front page down at the bottom, and it said written by, and it clicked in my head. This is an adult job. You can do this as an adult. You can make up these stories.
People can pay you for this?
Yeah. And I knew right then and there, this was what I wanted to do. Never in a million years did I think I'd be doing it. But,
to that level.
Yeah. And then after comics, of course, came fiction. Like everyone else my age, I discovered Stephen King early on. I think for me, it was Night Shift was the first thing I read, followed quickly by Salem's Lot and The Stand. And, from Steve, it led me to others who were prominent at the time. F. Paul Wilson and Robert R. McCammon and Dean Koontz, of course. And then working my way back through who came before them. Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, H.P. Lovecraft, Richard Matheson, Robert Bloch. So, by my teenage years, I was well steeped in horror fiction, horror films. Movies were a little tougher to come by. You had to rely on whatever
television.
Whatever your local TV host was showing on a Saturday night.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time I was in high school, video stores were a thing. So, then I got to start seeing a lot of cool stuff.
How old were you when you read The Stand? It's a pretty long one.
First time I read The Stand, I think I was 11. And I've reread it every year since then. In fact,
starting on January 1st and ending on June 2nd.
No, I blow through it in about a month now. But what's interesting and what I've shared with folks is it's kind of like the Bible. My grandmother is 98 years old, reads her Bible every day. She's been reading it her whole life, and she swears there are still things she discovers every time, right? The Stand is like that for me. Every time I read it, there are still new angles that I pick up on or new things I didn't notice before. In fact, several years ago, I was in a pretty bad accident. I got burned, 3rd-degree burns on my arm and 2nd-degree on my face and head. And I was in the burn ward for a couple weeks. And my wife, she said, "What can I bring you?" And I said,
The Stand.
Yeah, bring me The Stand.
Cool. Let's see. So it's kind of funny when you mentioned the DC and Marvel comics. I also grew up reading comics. I had some relatives that moved away, and when they did that, my older cousins had left me their comic book collection. So I spent a lot of time poring over those. I was surprised you didn't bring up either. I think it was Strange Tales or The Witching Hour.
Witching Hour, I loved Witching Hour. In fact, that was the first horror comic that genuinely scared me. I don't remember the issue number, but the cover has a skeleton driving a bus, and these parents are sending their kid off to summer camp. And the story itself, the summer camp was run by this satanic cult. And I remember that just scared the crap out of me as a kid.
It's funny because that reminds me of a scene in Chris's webcomic, actually. They take over a summer camp.
Yeah.
Let's see. Did you participate in Halloween as a kid?
Yeah. I mean, rural Pennsylvania, small town Pennsylvania in the 70s, Halloween and Christmas were your participation was sort of required. By 4th grade, I was all in. I remember I wanted my mother to help me make a headless horseman costume. So she enlisted my dad to cut a piece of wood, and we put that on top of my head, painted it black with, red like blood, and then wore like this spandex shirt over top of it. So it looked like I had no head. Right. So yeah, I was big into Halloween. I liked trick-or-treating up until around maybe the time I was 10. And then I got more into the tricking part of it.
That's just the natural progression,
Yeah. And, I grew up next door to a cemetery. In fact, one of my best friends, his dad was the caretaker. So, we were always, we'd sneak out our windows at night and go run around the cemetery and scare ourselves silly. So yeah, I was steeped in it. By 10 or 11, I was addicted to the thrill that comes with the horror genre, be it watching Phantasm late at night on a Saturday night on a little black and white TV in my room, or be it that issue of The Witching Hour that we mentioned, or some of those stories in King's Night Shift. I loved the thrill I got from those, and it's something. It's a love that has never left me. I still love feeling that way.
Do you remember any particular scenes from Night Shift that gave you that thrill?
Probably the most visceral reaction I had to the stories in Night Shift was the story Graveyard Shift, which is set in a small town similar to the one I grew up in. And, it's a bunch of guys working shift work at a mill, something I was intimately familiar with. We had one industry in town, that was the paper mill. And my father worked 7 days a week shift work there. So right away, I recognized these characters. Marvel and DC Comics, for all their magic and wonder, they were usually set in the city, in urban environments. You didn't see a lot of small town stuff, particularly in the superhero comics. For some reason, everybody in the Marvel universe lived in New York City in the 70s.
Because that's where the writers lived.
Yeah, but with King, it was the world outside my door. So Graveyard Shift just scared the crap out of me. They're in this mill, and there's these mutant rats, and that really sparked a visceral reaction in little Brian.
What about Phantasm?
Phantasm, absolutely. I've told Don Coscarelli this. I've shared this with him. Phantasm hit me at the perfect time. I was the same age as the protagonist, Michael. I had the same jeans jacket. I had the same dirt bike. I didn't have an older brother, but there was an older kid in the neighborhood who I idolized, who drove that kind of car.
I was about to say, did you grow up later and drive a Barracuda?
No,
it was Reggie that had a Barracuda.
The older kid, had one. And, like I said, growing up next door to a cemetery, we would play there all the time. And of course, that's where the majority of Phantasm takes place, is in the cemetery. So that really, really hit me. It's a formative influence. My novel Ghoul, which was turned into a terrible movie by NBC Universal, you can see Phantasm's influence. I mean, that novel wears it on its sleeves, I think. So yeah, that's one that has always stayed with me, and I love the whole series. I know there's a lot of crap out there on the internet about the fifth and final movie. Well, for the budget they had for what was ostensibly supposed to originally be a web series, I thought they did a great job, and I think story-wise, it's a beautiful ending. I'm not ashamed to admit.
Yeah, I like the ambiguity at the end. A lot of people were pissed off about that, but no, it adds a whole new layer to it.
Exactly. I wept at the end of that. I rarely weep at movies.
Wow.
Big Fish, Saving Private Ryan. There's a couple, but yeah, Phantasm 5, Ravager. I wept at the end.
Yeah.
Two of the things that you've mentioned here, Phantasm and Night Shift, there's a lot of identification, shall we say?
Oh, yeah.
Doctor Strange, I'm thinking that's a bit of a stretch to say identification.
Well,
or am I missing something?
He wasn't my favorite Defender. I mean, he was the leader of the Defenders, but my favorite was the Hulk.
Okay.
And later on, when he joined the team, Damian Hellstrom, the son of Satan.
Okay.
I really dug that character. And, he was easily, of the Defenders lineup, particularly when J.M. DeMatteis took over as writer, he was the horror character, the son of Satan. He's literally supposed to be the Antichrist. He's supposed to be Damien Thorne, but instead of conquering the planet, he decides he's going to become a superhero and work against his father's wishes. But yeah, I liked his rebellious nature, I guess, particularly as a teenager.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And now that we're talking about it and I'm thinking about it, as a teenager, the comic characters I was most attracted to were the ones who weren't necessarily in New York City and who weren't necessarily fighting these global threats. They were fighting for the little people. Swamp Thing, during Alan Moore's run. Daredevil. Now, you could say, yeah, Daredevil's in New York City, but he's down in Hell's Kitchen
Right.
fighting for the little people. So there's definitely a lot of that. So we've already uncovered one thing here.
Let's see if it continues. Because, that's the interesting thing about these calls is sometimes you go in one direction and you think you get something, and then it turns out later that there's like 4 other things, and you got to go, okay, what are we looking at here?
Yep.
So your next door neighbor who lived in the cemetery, one potential, was he also a fan of horror, or,
No.
or did you have anybody else in the family or friends group who were?
Not in the family. I had a buddy of mine who was a big horror fan. So, we would swap Stephen King books and F. Paul Wilson books. And he wasn't so much in the comics. That was more my forte. But, we would trade off stuff. Most of the kids were into horror movies. So, I did have that in common with everybody. But as far as reading, other than that one buddy I mentioned, I was pretty much alone in that regard. Most of my friends were into sports and collecting baseball cards. They thought it was weird that I would collect these comic books. As we got older, they continued being into sports and hunting. My old man took me hunting, and I brought along a stack of comic books because I've bored
exactly.
tears.
You got to do something out there.
Yeah. Summer vacation, it was common for me to head out into the woods or head to a clubhouse and just sit there and read all day. I have a beautiful memory being 11 years old and working my way through The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings one summer in the middle of the woods. And it was like I was reading those books in Middle Earth.
Nice.
You know what I mean?
That may have answered one of our future questions that we'll get to here in a second.
Okay.
I'm going to ask 2 questions sort of as a pair. I'll start with the negative one first so we can end on the positive. Do you remember the first person that you hurt?
Yes.
Do you want to talk about
it? Yeah, because he and I have talked about it as adults. There was a period in, I guess it was 5th or 6th grade, where I was getting bullied pretty hard. And it was mainly by this one dude, but he had 3 or 4 friends who would engage in it as well. And after I got punched in the mouth and had my braces poked through my bottom lip, and spent the day at the hospital, I decided that's enough of this shit. So I decided I was going to start getting even with him. And the first thing I did is, my first day back at school, the principal calls me and the main bully to the office, and the main bully starts crying while we're waiting. And I'm like, what's wrong with you? Oh, my dad will kill me. You have to say you started the fight. And I said, all right, well, then you got to give me your comic book collection. So
nice.
So I went in, I told the principal, yeah, I started the fight. Principal clearly didn't believe me, but what could he do? We got out, and I told the bully, I said, I want that comic collection, or I'm going to go in and tell him the truth. The next day he showed up with his father, a box of comic books. But the second kid, it was one of these guys who hung around with him. And in art class, I went up behind him. Now, keep in mind, it's 5th grade, folks, and I feel guilty enough. I don't need you tearing me apart on Twitter about this, but I went up behind him and I boxed his ears. And what I didn't understand in 5th grade is you can burst somebody's eardrums doing that. Mm-hmm. So this bully is immediately reduced to tears, and I felt terrible. And I ran away from the school, and I'll never forget the one teacher, Miss Shorter. She was my English teacher. She got in her car and she came and she tracked me down.
Oh, wow.
And I apologized to the guy as a kid, but we had our 25th high school reunion a ways back, and he was there, and I pulled him aside, and he'd forgotten about it. He had completely forgotten about it. I had carried that guilt with me, that weight with me all those years. He'd completely forgotten about it. So it was all good, I guess, as they say, but I still feel guilty. So yeah, I remember the first person I hurt.
Do you remember the first person you helped?
Yeah. Her name was, I'm not sure I can use her name on the air. Okay. She likes her privacy, but yeah, she fell and skinned her knee. I think we were in 1st grade, and I helped her into the classroom and got the teacher to take care of her. So I'm grinning as I say it. She was one of those little childhood crushes, you know. But yeah, I remember helping her.
Nice.
And you know, that's my wife, author Mary San Giovanni, has pointed out what we just discussed there is pretty much my entire life. I have guilt for a lot of the things I've done in the past, but I grew up reading comic books. So she says I have this hero complex where I'm trying to write my ledger, so to speak. You know, I'm on the board of directors for a major charity, a major horror charity, Scares That Care. I bend over backwards to help people in an industry, sometimes at a detriment to myself and my own mental health. And she says it's all based on those comic books I read as a kid. That, you know, I don't know how not to help people, but I feel guilty at the same time. So I don't know if she's right about that or not. You guys can decide by the end of this episode, I guess.
It's kind of funny. I feel like sometimes I do the reverse. I definitely also have a very strong guilt complex at times too, but I also was raised to, how can I say this? My grandfather passed away before I was born, but he was the deacon of our church and my grandmother was the head lector. And they both had businesses where they were hairdressers and barbers, which are very dependent on the community for their livelihood. And so my grandmother was very, very, very anal about don't make any waves, don't fight, don't cause a scene, like none of that. And so I was a very good little boy. And so in my case, I feel there have been times in my life where I'm like, you know what? I've got a little karma to burn. You know, so because you were going to say something a minute ago?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Did you have any scary dreams when you were a kid?
Oh, yeah. I've actually written a small chapbook about this called The Triangle of Belief. It's nonfiction.
Okay.
And I swear we're not going to go into Whitley Strieber territory here, but I used to have a recurring dream. You know, I can't say that I saw gray aliens coming into my room, but I did suffer from sleep paralysis. Mm-hmm. And in that sleep paralysis, I would get pecked and poked and prodded by these shadowy black chickens.
Okay.
Now I grew up.
Well, that's a new twist on the whole sleep paralysis game.
You know, I grew up on a farm.
Okay.
So I was exposed to chickens. Mm-hmm. As an adult, I had the opportunity to meet one of the researchers who worked on the first actual scientific study of this whole alien abduction sleep paralysis thing. You know, to see what the psychological cause was for this shared thing that so many people were experiencing. And she told me that one of the things they discovered early on in the study is that children would often, they're so terrified, they would come up with a mask animal to make the experience seem more normal. Owls were reported, different animals. So for growing up on a farm, you know, having chickens, I don't know, maybe these dreams stopped when I became an adult, and I always chalked them up to, they were just, you know, they were night terrors. It was some weird thing. But it unnerved me that both of my sons experienced similar dreams as children and saw similar animals that I did. I can't explain it. Again, we're not going into Whitley Strieber territory. I'm not saying that I was abducted by aliens or anything like that, but it was something unexplainable. You could say they were nightmares, but to me, they were much more than that. You know, it was
maybe all the kids in your town were abducted and drugged by a local cult and not aliens, and they had you pecked by chickens in your sleep.
That's your webcomic, isn't it?
That's the next one I'm gonna write.
No, it was I'm not a new agey crystal guy or anything like that, but I'm convinced it was a glimpse behind the curtain. You know, that there's other things going on in this world that we just can't explain. So,
anything in real life terrify you as a kid?
Oh yeah, I had a deep and abiding loathing of snakes. I still do as an adult.
Okay, Indy.
Yeah. I mean, and this was before Indiana Jones, but yeah, I don't know why. I wasn't startled by one as a young child or anything. From birth, I have a somewhere back in the primordial lizard part of my brain. I have a not even a fear, just a hatred of snakes.
Okay.
Is it a subconscious religious thing?
Who knows? I don't know. Actual fears. I was pretty fearless as a kid. I guess the one thing that I did fear was that people wouldn't like me. So I was always the class clown. My three main influences in media as a child were Han Solo, David Lee Roth, and Burt Reynolds' character, the Bandit, from the Smoking the Bandit movies. Now, you can draw direct lines and get a nice, perfect triangle between those three. So that was the personality I developed early on, was, the class clown, the daredevil. That was my only real fear, is that people wouldn't like me, that I'd be abandoned. I've thought about that as an adult, and I'm not sure where it stemmed from. My parents were loving people. There was no chance of divorce. They didn't fight. My dad had some PTSD left over from Vietnam, but he worked through that. So I'm not sure where that fear of abandonment came from, but yeah, it was there. As an adult,
you read.
Yeah, as an adult, there's all kinds of things that scare me. Cancer scares me. Alzheimer's scares me. Something happening to my children scares me. What's happening to our country scares me. But
the ever constant progression of time itself, just ticking away the blocks of life that you only have a finite amount of left.
Yeah, see, that doesn't bother me.
Okay.
I'm pretty happy, pretty content with what I've achieved and where my children are in life. So the ticking clock doesn't bother me, but the world they may inherit after I'm gone and I'm not here to help them, that terrifies me.
Yeah, decay is not pleasant.
No.
So the one that you probably already answered, flipping around that last question of any fears in childhood, of like real life fears, the next question would be, were there any times in your childhood where you felt completely calm or safe or bliss? And that's where I was thinking, maybe The Hobbit. And
anytime, every week. Well, I would do this twice a week. I'd ride my BMX Mongoose bike to the newsstand and get new comic books and new paperbacks. And on Sundays, I'd ride my BMX Mongoose bike to the flea market and I'd buy old comic books and old paperbacks. And in the aftermath, when I was sitting in the clubhouse or sitting in the woods or sitting in my room reading, completely at peace, complete tranquility, losing myself in horror fiction and other genres, of course, as well. But horror was always my go-to. That's when I felt at peace. Horror made me happy.
There you go. Show's over.
So moving into teen years, what were some of the major media that impressed you in your teen years?
Again, the comics, I think I mentioned earlier, in the 70s, Steve Gerber was doing the Defenders. By the 80s, it was J.M. DeMatteis, and, he kept up the horror theme, but he brought this whole new humanity to it, really fleshing out these characters. And at that point, I knew I wanted to write. So I really started studying what he was doing. Frank Miller on Daredevil, same thing. And fiction, I remember being 17, 18, 19. I graduated high school at 17, immediately went into the Navy. And at that point, I'm discovering Joe R. Lansdale, Jack Ketchum, Skip Inspector, David Scow. Those guys at the time, they were knocking horror on its head. Even Stephen King's stuff was safe in some regard. And these guys, they weren't playing by the rules. Their horror fiction was not safe. So that really grabbed my attention. Stephen King, I loved his stuff. And Steve, if you're listening to this, you'll know what I'm saying. I loved his stuff, but so did my mother. When I finished a Stephen King book, Mom wanted to borrow it. She wasn't borrowing, Skip Inspector's The Light at the End or David Scow's The Kill Riff, though, So movie-wise, as I said, by then, video stores were a thing. So it's Evil Dead 2 and all this stuff that never played at the theater in town, or that, was R-rated at the time. You couldn't get in to see it. I remember having just a huge reaction to Evil Dead 2, watching it on VHS. Laugh out loud, funny, over the top gore, and some genuinely scary moments.
Yeah, Raimi's good like that.
Yeah,
it's a good mixture of both the comedy, yet it's not too comedic where you just let down your defenses.
Exactly. Whatever. It was this balancing act that I don't think he ever gets the credit for that he deserves.
I recognize it. Yeah. I recognize you, Sam Raimi. Please be on our show.
we see you, Sam. You are heard. But yeah, a lot of indie stuff and low budget stuff like that. So.
You mentioned Skip Inspector, the light at the end. Was there a particular scene in that book that stood out to you? Not
that one, but one of their follow-ups, The Cleanup, which was basically Charles Bronson's death wish with superpowers. It was M. Night Shyamalan's, what was the one he did with Bruce Willis? Unbreakable?
Yes.
Yeah, it was Unbreakable years before Unbreakable was ever made. And the guy basically... He's a vigilante. He's going to clean up the city streets, but he becomes a monster in the process. That one was it was so violent, and the way they painted that canvas with just words. We talked about Evil Dead 2. The blood and the violence and the gore, they're there on display. Your brain doesn't have to fill in the details. Mm-hmm. With fiction, with prose, your brain is doing all the work. And Skip Inspector were brilliant with that. Not to get off on a tangent, but I always bring up Survivor by my best friend in the world, J.F. Gonzalez, who's no longer with us. But Survivor is often held up by critics and historians as one of the most extreme horror novels ever written, and it is. But there's a scene in that book where everybody thinks that he described in detail the death of this infant, and he did not. He breaks the scene, takes you away from it to something else, and then comes back, and the infant is dead. And when you point that out to people that no, he never describes the death of the infant, your brain filled those details in. They're shocked. That's something that is unique to prose fiction. And as a teenager, I was definitely keying in on that with those guys, and Richard Lehman, of course, early efforts by Edward Lee. It was a whole new level of horror fiction.
So what I think you're talking about there potentially might start touching on something that does come up in some of these calls, which is that once someone becomes a creator or decides that this is what they want to do for a living, then they start focusing on, and you already mentioned this earlier, that starting to focus on how to do what you do. And there starts to become an interest in the auteur part of it.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is good. However, my gut tells me that's a different thing, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm wondering if there was anything in your teenage years that you experienced that was that gut level, I love this, or I'm afraid of this, that didn't relate to the auteur part of it. Do you know what I'm saying?
I don't think I had anything like that, really.
Okay. I mean, not every question's going to land.
Yeah, I mean, like I remember, I guess the closest I came was when I was in high school. I got in-school detention. These days, they would have just kicked me out of school. But back then, they'd give you in-school detention. I had 30 days of in-school detention.
Oh, wow.
So I'd show up at high school, and I would have to go sit apart from the rest of the student body. Now, just to clarify for the listening audience, all I did was I got caught smoking weed under the bleachers.
You deviant.
Yeah. But so I had a copy of Dark Forces. It was an anthology by Kirby McCauley. And the very first story in it is The Mist by Stephen King. Mm. And I would get all my classwork finished in the first hour. And I still have 6 more hours to sit there by myself. Mm-hmm. And you can do whatever you want. So I wrote The Mist out by hand because I wanted to see what it felt like to write The Mist. And when I was done, I started my own novel, which was called Satan's Mist. And it was basically the plot of The Mist, but it was in my town. And then I started using everybody I knew as characters in the book. And I immediately felt very guilty about what I was doing to them. And I worried, oh my God, what if someone found this? They'd think I really wanted this to happen. So I put it aside. Yeah, it was never finished. I still have that handwritten manuscript. It'll go into the collection at the University of Pittsburgh. They're collecting all my papers. So it'll go in there if people want to read it. But I guess that's the closest I ever had to that, maybe. You know, it was like, I want to be an auteur, but I don't want to do this.
Or you wanted to, but you didn't want to get in trouble for it.
That might be it.
Yeah, there's that aspect too. No, but that's two really interesting and good and powerful writing techniques there. Like, not only are you rewriting something, so it's kind of like what teachers always tell you, when you bitch about taking notes, like, why do I have to write all these notes? Because writing it helps you memorize it.
Exactly.
So writing out the full novel like that not only helps you memorize the story, but it helps you memorize the techniques, the prose, the art of writing in general. And you can kind of, in a way, wear Stephen King's shoes for a moment while you're rewriting this novel. Yep. And also, it brings it close to home by bringing in your own personal characters. So it helps you do that whole write from life aspect too.
Exactly. And I didn't know any of that at the time. But what I found,
you didn't have to, you were just doing it.
What I found later is a lot of authors do that at some point. Hunter S. Thompson did it. Jack Ketchum did it. Gene O'Neill. So, I was just a lower middle class kid from the country. I didn't know any of that, but I knew I liked the feeling of copying that novella. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Experience.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in your teen years, you got more into tricking than treating. Let's see. No particular favorite or least favorite costumes. I guess you didn't.
No. Yeah. By then it was, dress like a ninja so we don't get caught while we're toilet paper in the principal's house.
Toilet paper ninjas. Yeah.
Any scary dreams as a teen?
No, not really. Okay. The sleep paralysis and stuff ended, in my teenage years.
Anything really terrifying happen in real life as a teen?
I'm thinking about it. Nothing terrifying. I got my first taste of mortality. My grandparents on my father's side both passed. My grandfather, I was pretty close to. He had lived with us for several summers when I was a teenager. He was an ex-Prohibition era moonshiner from West Virginia.
Oh, okay.
And he was a hellion. I was a bit of a hellion too, but I guess it skips a generation. My dad was a good kid, and both my sons are good kids, but my grandfather and I were hellions. And when he passed, I was pretty upset, but I didn't really have the tools to articulate it. And I didn't articulate it until years later with a novel. And I finally got to write about that, fictionalized. So nothing scary,
okay.
But definitely there were some traumatic things, and that's one of them.
Right. Mm-hmm. Any moments of complete calm or safety or bliss?
Oh yeah. First girlfriend, that childhood sweetheart who I mentioned earlier, as teenagers, that becomes something very different. And, in those moments, particularly, that first kiss outside of a YMCA building at like 6:00 in the morning after being up all night.
Oh,
I'm smiling now thinking about it. And when my wife listens to this later, she's going to be like, oh, really?
You in the doghouse now.
But honey, it was years before I ever met you.
Of course.
But yeah, that was a moment of pure peace. And of course, like I said before, anytime I was reading was escapism as well.
Right. Moving into adult years. Favorite media in your adult years?
It still comes back to it. Comic books, movies, and especially books. As far as favorites, oh gosh. See, now as an adult, we get into what we were talking about earlier. Now you're an auteur. Now you're a creator. And what I've learned Um, at my level of notoriety, if I list anything as a favorite,
Right. Yeah.
somebody else is going to say, "Well, why didn't you list mine?"
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm hesitant to do that. But I read voraciously. I put out a newsletter every Sunday. It's free. It doesn't cost anything, and I always list in there what I'm reading. And if I enjoy it, I'll say a few good words about it. But I do find that I'll be 56 next month, and I do find that I'm not as enamored with new horror films the way I used to be. It has to be particularly good to get my attention. Now, there are filmmakers like Jed Shepard or Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead that, I stand them hard. Anything they put out, I'll watch. Or there's an Asian film called The Sadness. I don't know if any of you have seen it.
Yes.
It's
basically the Cross the movie.
Yeah. I was sent to an interview with the filmmaker. He listed the Crossed, the comic book, and my novel, The Complex, as two big influences. And I see it, and I'm honored by that.
Yeah.
I loved that film. But I do find when it comes to film these days, I tend to go through Shudder and see what's available, and then go pick a different genre somewhere else. And I'm not sure why that is. Yeah. But fiction, I still heavily read the genre. Of course, part of that is from a business sense. You want to see what your peers are doing. You want to see what's going on. Right. But part of it is still for pleasure. And my main hobby these days is rebuilding that comic book collection I had as a kid. So
nice.
Yeah.
The avoidance, shall we say, I think that might very possibly could tie into something that we've talked about on the show before. In my case, I relate it to music in that, as a kid, there are certain songs that you hear that really hit on a particular emotion. And then that song becomes tied to that emotion for you. And then later in life, you hear other songs that relate to that emotion, and they don't have the same impact because, as Chris had said at the time, the seat's taken. You've already got something in that spot, and it's hard for something else to kick it out of its place. And it's possible that you might be feeling similar things in terms of the horror genre.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. Going back to the conversation about things that came to mind in your adult years of what media you liked. Yeah, we understand that there's a lot of stuff, and also the politics involved potentially, but usually, from a psychological standpoint, and hopefully the listeners would understand this as well, that the first things that come to mind often come to mind for a reason.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about The Sadness. You mentioned that there were things about that you liked. Can you think of any one thing that really stood out to you?
I mean, I liked that it absolutely pulled no punches. It was not safe. It didn't play by the rules. I liked just that frenetic pace about it. It's the same thing. You know what? I will list one of my peers, Brian Smith. Anytime Brian puts a novel out, I immediately stop whatever else I'm reading and I read that. And I read Brian's stuff for the same reason that I like The Sadness. He doesn't play by the rules. He does not pull his punches. He and I wrote one novel together, Suburban Gothic, and it's the most violent, breakneck thing I think either one of us have ever written.
And I think wasn't adapted into a film, was it?
Not officially, but yeah, there certainly is a film that seems to borrow heavily from Suburban Gothic now, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, that definitely perked my ears up. Richard Bate Jr. is one of my favorite directors. Yeah. Love all of his films, but your description of the book does not sound like the film.
Yeah.
A little bit more serious.
Yeah. Like. But, I think the reason the book turned out the way it did is because Brian and I were trying to one-up each other. Mm-hmm. He's a hard one to one-up. So, yeah, I when it comes to new media these days, I tend to go in horror. I tend to go for stuff that's going to challenge me, stuff that I haven't seen before, or I'm a big believer in it's all been done. What we do now is we put our own stamp, our own take on it. So I want I go to things that are an original take. You know what I mean? Everybody's done the werewolf, the zombie, the vampire. Let's see your new take on it. Mm-hmm. That'll get my attention every time.
I combined ghouls and necromancy. You're right. Everything has been done at this point. So what you either have to do is put your own flavor on something, or maybe do a mashup. Like, I was thinking about this the other day. So hostage kidnap horror situation, only it's people at first, and then it turns out that people are kidnapping humans for aliens. So you have your hostage kidnap situation and alien abduction.
I like it. See, that's a new twist.
Yeah. Patent pending.
Yes. It's copyrighted now because this has been recorded.
Yes.
You may have already answered a question that I was going to ask. You mentioned both with the Sadness and Brian Smith the word frenetic, which hadn't come up previously. Is there something that interests you about a frenetic pace?
Yeah, I think like I said, I was a daredevil as a kid, and I guess I was also a daredevil most of my adult life. I'm not tooting my horn, but we talked earlier that hero complex that got embedded in me as a kid. My wife Mary likes to laugh at me if the fire siren goes off. I'm usually going to see where the fire is in the neighborhood and see if I can help. I'm the guy running towards the burning building. So I guess when it comes to entertainment, it's harder to get my pulse pounding these days. So I like things with that sort of pace that, suck me in.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Halloween as an adult.
Don't celebrate it simply because, we celebrate it. We decorate the house. But my youngest son is 15 now. He's at that age where trick-or-treating is no longer cool. But he's a good kid, so he's not out tricking either. And we don't have trick-or-treaters show up because we live in such a rural area. So it's kind of sad. We put up the decorations and we go through the motions, but it feels like an empty holiday here. It's not like Christmas where, you have the family all gathered together. It's sort of a bummer. And plus, Halloween is really a working holiday for us. Mary and I, we're both writers. We both work in horror. Usually that's our busiest time of year. It's when, we're doing the most signings, the most conventions, etc. So there's just not a lot of time to properly celebrate it.
Almost makes it more occupational.
Yeah.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right? Yeah. Can somewhat relate.
Do you remember the last person you hurt?
Yeah, I do, but we're not going to talk about that one on the air.
Okay.
Do
you remember the last person you helped?
Yeah. Like I said, we talked about the charity I'm involved with, Scares the Care. It's composed of horror professionals and horror fans. Every year we pick a child suffering from a disease like cancer. We pick a woman battling breast cancer, and we pick a burn victim. And we raise a minimum of $10,000 for each of them. Awesome. And then we always have money left over. So, we're trying to expand the mission to help more people. If there's a horror professional in trouble, for example, author Laird Barron was in serious trouble last year. Author Elizabeth Massey was fighting cancer. We help folks like that out as well. So that's a weekly thing, checking in with the group. And as far as helping somebody, I helped author Wesley Southard yesterday. He's an author in his 30s. He's great. He's been reading me since high school. I first signed books for him in college, and when he was in college, and he told me he wanted to be a writer, and now he's doing it. But he had a moment of doubt, a crisis of faith yesterday, and he called his mentor, and I talked him through it the same way Joe Lansdale or Paul Wilson or Dave Scow or any of the other people we've mentioned have talked me through it when I was at that stage. And that's really what it's all about. As both a fan of horror and as somebody who makes his living in this genre, I'm not trying to be funny here. Horror has made me happy my entire life. You asked when when were my moments of peace? It was when I could retreat into that genre. And as an adult, to be able to give back to that genre and maybe give that escapism or that peace to other people, I mean, it's the best feeling in the world. It's the best job in the world. But as somebody who's doing that job, every single person I mentioned, from Stephen King and Steve Gerber to Skip Inspector and Scal, every one of them has helped me in my professional career. So it's doubly awesome to be able to help people like Wesley Southard. And the hope is 10, 20 years from now, he's doing it for somebody else,
Right.
It's a beautiful circle.
Agreed. We haven't really talked about too much on the podcast. I think it's come up once, maybe twice before, but I know I've talked to you about this at StokerCon and a couple of our other previous guests. But for the listeners, actually what we're planning on doing we were debating on whether or not to do this for our 4th anniversary or 5th. I think we're going to push it out to our 5th just so we can get more autographs. But we had a t-shirt made up with the Horror Makes Us Happy logo, and we're trying to get as many of our previous guests to sign this as we can. And then we're going to donate that to Scares the Care so that they can auction it off for their charity.
And that's awesome.
Yes. But thought I would put that out there because coming up towards the 5th anniversary, we'll be talking about that more and trying to get the word out there so that, people who are interested in getting these autographs on one particular item, hopefully will bid on this and raise some money for charity.
And we appreciate that. And I'll tell you that's one of the things I enjoy most about being involved with Scares That Carry. It's seeing how other horror professionals support the charity. Kane Hodder, who played Jason in some of the Friday the 13th films, or Sid Haig, who's no longer with us, they would bend over backwards for this charity. Jonathan Jans, the writer, he goes above and beyond for this charity. And he's not a member of the charity. He's not on the board. He just he does things and things like this with the T-shirt. It means a lot and it matters, and it's neat to see the community come together for stuff like that, particularly these days when on social media, it seems like there's nothing but infighting in the community. It's neat to see everybody coalesce and come back together for things like that.
I think a lot of people probably do want to try to help, but don't know how. And it's kind of funny even saying that because you mentioned Jonathan Jans. I had never even heard of Scares of Care until Jonathan had posted on his social media about the award that he got from them.
Yeah, there you go.
There were a couple other things going on in my head around the same time, and it just so happened that the ideas kind of all gelled together, and I realized, holy shit, this is something that we could do. But nobody had told me I could do that, or we could do that. So, like I say, I think there are a lot of people out there who want to help, but don't know how, and it's sometimes a challenge of trying to find a creative way to say, well, what can I do? What can we do?
I mean, can I plug it?
Sure.
The easiest thing to do, go to scaresthatcare.org and you can make a donation, $5, and that goes towards the families we're helping this year. But beyond that, the charity's been around 16 years. We do at least one convention every year. 100% of the proceeds go to our families. Next year, we're actually doing 2. We're doing one in Williamsburg, Virginia, and we're doing one in St. Louis, Missouri. But we do all kinds of other things too. We do charity auctions. We do Facebook donation days. We do Christmas parties, dances. We used to do, back when I had the horror show with Brian Keene podcast, we used to do a 24-hour live telethon.
Oh, nice.
And those were great. One year we did $30,000 in 24 hours. I slept for 7 days after that.
Sure.
But the easiest thing to do, just go to scaresthatcare.org. And, if you don't have the means to make a donation, that's okay. You can go there and find out how to share our mission and tell others about our mission. And you can see events we do have coming up and things like that.
Cool. We're also going to put together a bio page for you, and we can link to that from the bio page as well.
Cool.
Something you said earlier reminded me of a question that I had forgotten to ask in the childhood section. And that is, some of our guests have reported that there was sort of a dividing line where prior to that line, they were actually afraid of horror, and then something happened, and then it became a more positive experience or a pleasurable one. Was there a dividing line for you, or was it always enjoyment?
I never had it. I enjoyed it from day one.
Okay.
The first monster, I was 6 years old, and the first monster was the Man-Thing, Marvel Comics, and right after him came Frankenstein, the old black and white Frankenstein, Boris Karloff, and that was it for me. I loved them immediately, and so there was never a dividing line.
Cool. The reason that I wanted to ask that is because sometimes, that might highlight something interesting. And in your case, it sounds like, I've had a conversation on our Discord server with one of our followers that, there's, I guess, two ways of looking at psychology. And one is from a trauma-based perspective, and the other one is from more of a joy-based perspective. And it's kind of interesting in your case. Well, you know what? Actually, let me push that off for a little bit, and we'll come back to that a little more, because there are a couple other questions I could ask you now.
But I want to touch on this because now you got my brain thinking.
Okay.
Have you ever had a guest who said they had a dividing line later in life?
Ooh.
Me.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
Me too.
Steve has never really been a fan of comics, or you were definitely a fan of comics.
I had a moment. This was this must have been almost a decade ago, because JF Gonzalez was still alive. But JF and I were in the car, and film director Mike Lombardo was in the back seat. And Mike is in his mid-30s now, so he must have been in his 20s then. And he's telling us about this brand new movie he just saw called A Serbian Film. And I'm not going to tell the plot to your listeners, but basically it involves,
if you know.
Yeah, it involves very, very terrible things happening to children.
Very early in the movie.
Yeah. And Mike is
first scene.
Mike's explaining this to us, and he's raving about just how over the top and visceral and mean this movie was. And Jesus and I are looking in the back seat like he's lost his fucking mind. And it occurred to me during that drive, Jesus and I are older and we're both parents now. We don't want that imagery in our heads. And yet Jesus is the guy that wrote Survivor. And of course, I'd done bad things to children in books 10 years before that. So becoming parents, there was a new dividing line that didn't exist before. If we had been Mike's age, we would have probably been all over A Serbian Film. But at that stage in our life, we knew we didn't need to see it ever and never have.
Okay. We have actually had that on the show a couple of times.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about like the opposite, like an interest in horror later on in life. But definitely a couple of parents have expressed that, once you have a child, it changes things. You cannot watch a child get hurt or killed or just get hurt in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought the same as Chris. For me, I've never considered myself a horror fan, but there have been things in my adult life that, after having gone through my counseling and 12-step and that kind of journey in recovery, that I have identified certain things in certain genres that do speak to me. But that didn't come until I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s.
Right.
So the next couple questions I want to ask, this is sort of where we start getting into the wrap up and covering your entire life. Okay. And the next two questions are not just about horror. So this could be anything. And I'll give you the two questions at the same time, because it could be two different answers or the same answer. And those questions are, what movie have you watched more times than any other? And then favorite movie.
More times than any other, John Carpenter's The Thing.
Okay.
And it is... My favorite horror movie switches between The Thing and The Exorcist 3, but today the Thing is my favorite.
No one ever likes The Exorcist 2.
With good
It's
like,
reason. 1, 3. There was a second. No, there wasn't. Nope.
Mary and I, of course, we were peers and friends in this business long before we ever started dating or ever got married. I mean, we were friends for a good 20 years, but we bonded very early on over The Exorcist 3 and The Thing. And married life with us, a glimpse into our married life, we'll quote lines from both movies at each other throughout the day. We know them by heart, and yet we still see how
I imagine You Gotta Be Fucking Kidding Me gets a lot of use, right?
It's a lot of use. if one of us doesn't hear the other and we say, I'm sorry, what did you say? I'm signaling beings on Mars. Sometimes they answer.
Nothing. Let's see. So, favorite scenes that I guess you just mentioned, the whole thing, so it might be hard to pick out a particular scene, but in either one of those movies, is there a particular scene that jumps out to you?
I mean, as I always tell people, if you want one of the original OG jump scares, there's a scene in Exorcist 3. Again, I'm not going to spoil it for your listeners, but it's the hospital hallway scene.
Yep.
And the camera work is so great.
Chef's kiss.
Because you're about to fast forward. You're like, what the hell is this long ass, boring, drawn out scene? And then bam, they get you. And in the Thing, it's always going to be where the guy's head tears itself off his body, grows legs, and runs away.
It's just practical top 3 right there, like of all time.
Yeah.
2055, we'll still be talking about that scene as one of the best scenes in practical effects.
Yep. I mean, I'm a huge Carpenter fan, and John's a super great guy, and I have many favorites. Escape from New York, They Live, which curiously is my 15-year-old's favorite film. They Live.
It's rather topical currently.
Yeah, but tell me about it. But the Thing, just for the practical effects, and as we said earlier in talking about Evil Dead 2, there's some humor in the Thing that I don't think people touch on enough. You've got to be fucking kidding me! It's
when the chess computer cheats on him, he just pours his fucking J&W into it. Cheating bitch.
I think both of those things, the Evil Dead 2 and this head tearing itself off, kind of align itself with the David Lee Roth portion of those three.
Oh, yeah. Over the top and
funny, yeah. When you were talking about that, the first thing that came to mind was Hot for Teacher, the video.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, not to get off on a whole tangent, because I know you got limited time here, but I that has not aged well. I showed it to my 15-year-old.
No.
Yeah. He looked at me like, really, Dad?
Yeah, the stripper in front of the kids. Little dicey.
The 80s were simpler times.
They were. It was a different time.
Well, I mean, I think it's also like if you were a kid today at the age of those kids, I think most of those kids probably were too young to really understand what was funny about the video.
Right.
And your son being 15 is now getting into that part where he does understand. It's like,
Yep.
But you show that to a 4-year-old, they're like, whatever.
True.
So do you see any common threads about what kind of horror you like? Cannibalism, occult, metaphysical, supernatural?
What kind I like or what kind I create?
Ooh, both?
Both?
Yes.
We can expand that question, Steve.
I mean, what kind I like, I think, is just as long as I'm entertained.
Okay.
As long as it's not boring me. As long as I'm not on page 50 or half an hour into the movie and I'm yelling, for God's sake, somebody throw a pie or something, That's easy. I want to be entertained. I want to be moved. I want to have an emotional reaction. It doesn't have to be a happy reaction, but I want to have some kind of reaction. As far as a creator, I've always created from a fan's perspective. My very first novel, The Rising, was a zombie novel. And the reason I wrote a zombie novel is because nobody else was doing zombie novels. The last one to have come out was Philip Nutman's Wetwork, and there was nothing. And I thought, well, I'm going to write the kind of novel that I want to read. And I've always approached everything I've done from that perspective. What would I want to read? What would make me entertained? But I also recognize there's a deeper underlying subtext with my stuff. And again, I'm not tooting my horn because critics and reviewers have pointed this out too. I was raised on, we mentioned early in the show, Stephen King's stuff was set in a small town that I recognized, and a lot of horror before that was not. But I learned early on as a creator was how diverse my audience was. In a lot of horror fiction at the time, sure, it could be set in a small town, but the cast was predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Christians. And when I would go out and do book signings, that wasn't my audience at all. My audience was incredibly diverse. So very early on, I tried to represent them in what I was writing. And this was years before we had buzzwords like representation and things like that. I felt it was the thing to do because it was what attracted me to these books early on. And, you know, I wanted, as a fan, I wanted to continue that experience for others. So those are definitely the through lines that I see going through it. On one level, whether I'm reading it or whether I'm writing it, it's got to be entertaining. But on another level, it has to be about real people, because that's what evokes that emotional reaction in the reader or the viewer.
Right.
Yeah. So it helps you identify with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Any emotion, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's not horror, but, you know, I always point to The Sopranos. We should actively loathe Tony Soprano. He is not a good guy. You know, he does some heinous shit throughout that series, and yet we love him and we find ourselves rooting for him. That's because the writers have created this empathy for the character. You can identify with parts of him. If you're doing Friday the 13th and you just have Jason carving up surplus teenagers, that gets boring. If you give a shit about those teenagers before Jason starts carving them up, it's much more entertaining and it's much more likely to stick, you know? So
character development is important.
Yeah. So I guess that's the through line for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the point where I would point out whatever common themes that, you know, seem to be coming up, and then we can talk about those.
Yeah, let's hear your take.
Yes.
Well, really 3 things, but I think 2 of them subsume under one of them, and the 2 are guilt and thrill. And then what they subsume under would be identification. You talked a lot, even just a couple minutes ago, about identifying with characters in the things that you've read, as well as the things that you write. There's an underlying through line of guilt going all the way back to childhood, but also thrill. You know, you talked about being a bit of a hellion. And I guess, I mean, the next question would be, why is it that those things are important to you? Think thrill, and this is where I was talking a moment ago about the difference between a trauma-based perspective versus a joy-based perspective, and how I think it's kind of interesting because it seems like you've got one of each, the guilt and the thrill. Guilt might be trauma-based, and then thrill might be joy-based, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Steve, all the money I spent on talk therapy a few years ago, I could have just talked to you instead. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's trauma-based from childhood, but there's a lot of guilt there. We touched on it earlier. I don't
want to interrupt you, but quickly let me say, when I say trauma-based, I don't necessarily mean that something bad happened to you, but like, I'll give you an quick example. There was something that I read, without talking about what it is. There's just something that I read or maybe saw on TV that like hit me in a really deeply emotional spot that has affected me for the rest of my life.
Right.
And it's not necessarily like something bad happened to me, but there can be something that's, for lack of a better word, traumatic that, you know.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead and
I
say
mean,
what
no,
you were gonna say.
I guess there was, and you know, that was the David Lee Roth Han Solo in me earlier, trying to give you the entertaining answer. But you know, the fact is, 2 of my childhood friends were being abused at home, and you know, I said my parents were great, and my parents were great, but I also touched on my dad had some pretty bad PTSD from Vietnam, and he did. And my first 8 or 9 years were not pleasant as a result of that. So that wanting to get attention, wanting people to like me, and then once I got their attention, wanting to keep their attention, it probably all stems from that. And that ties in exactly with what you just said. And then the things that I would do to get their attention, I would sometimes feel guilty about because I went too far.
Chris?
And there are some critics who would say that holds true with my novels.
I don't know if you heard it, but I just threw a line at Chris. I was like, Chris.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Nope. No, we don't buy.
Your turn, Chris.
I've never heard anything like that ever before in my life. No, it obviously makes a lot of sense once you add some of that additional context. So thank you for adding that.
Yeah.
So next question. Now that we've identified why some of these things are important to you, why horror? Because aren't there other genres that can touch on some of these things? And I think, again, this kind of is interesting dividing line between the guilt stuff and the thrill stuff, because yes, there are other genres that touch on the thrill stuff, maybe not so much the guilt stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that horror, for the most part, is more clear cut. There's good and there's evil. Now, sure, there can be shades of gray in horror, just as there can in any other genre. But at the end of the day, horror, in its purest form, is still about good versus evil, light versus dark. Some of your other genres, it's not always that clear cut.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that probably goes back to those early comic books, where it was the same thing, good versus evil.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, real life doesn't work that way, but
right.
That's why we escape into horror.
Exactly. That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's an escape.
And that's
not real life.
And it's personal preference too. I mean, there are other people who seek out the gray, and if you particularly preferring the clear cut, that's, like I said, just a personal preference, which is fine.
Right. I mean, not to go on a political tangent, and I certainly don't want to offend any listeners or you guys, but I was actually talking about this with one of my sons the other day. You can actively think that Donald Trump is a monster. I personally think Donald Trump is a monster. And you can actively dislike a number of his followers, but you can't just automatically assume that every single person who voted for Donald Trump is an evil person, because that's not factually true. And this is what I was trying to explain to my kid. But in horror fiction, they can all be zombies, and then it's easier to feel that way. But, in real life, of course, there are shades of gray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just horror, but I think all media, it's not only that you can simplify it, but in a lot of ways, sometimes you have to simplify, because if you don't, then, trying to get into too many levels of nuance, just you go way past Stephen King levels of verbosity.
Yes.
I mean, that's when you start getting into like being a historian and having, a 13 volume set of,
or Dan Simmons' Drood and the Terror. I don't know if you guys have read those, but those things make The Stand seem like a novella. They're great books, but they take a while to read. Or Jerusalem by Alan Moore. That's the longest novel you'll ever read. Great novel, but you'll only read it once, because we have a limited amount of time here on the planet.
Exactly. So last question, is there anything that you've thought of that might be relevant but hasn't come up on the call? Maybe an idea popped ahead and then we took a left turn?
No, I think we covered it in all the left turns that we took.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time. Like I say, we'll get together, we'll put together a bio for you. I'll get together offline and also get like pictures that we can put together, excerpts, and put them up on TikTok and Instagram and all that kind of fun stuff.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you to anybody out there listening. Please do come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com. Support us on Patreon, tell a friend, all that kind of fun stuff. And thank you very much.